Some men become legends not because of what they did, but because of what others believed they could do. In the cotton fields of Georgia, there lived a man who moved through locked doors as if they were made of air. He walked past armed guards as if invisible. He entered the most secure homes in the county, and not a single plantation owner dared to stop him. This wasn't magic. This wasn't folklore. This was something far more disturbing, a power born from fear itself, from secrets too dark to speak aloud, and from a truth that would destroy everyone who tried to reveal it. His name was Thomas. And by the time you understand why no one stopped him, you'll realize that some prisons have no bars, and some chains can't be broken even by freedom itself. The first time anyone noticed Thomas's unusual freedom was on a humid August night in 1857, when Mrs. Elizabeth Hartley woke to the sound of her bedroom door closing. Not opening, closing. She lay in the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs, trying to convince herself she'd imagine it. The house settled and creaked in the summer heat. Old wood did that. There was nothing unusual about a door moving slightly in the night, except she knew, with the certainty that comes from true terror, that someone was in her room. Her husband, plantation owner Richard Hartley, was away on business in Savannah, a trip planned for weeks. The house was locked, every door bolted before the household retired. 3 overseers patrolled the grounds with rifles and dogs trained since puppyhood to tear apart any slave found outside the quarters after dark. The animals had cost Richard $200 each, imported from a breeder in Virginia who specialized in what he called plantation security. Elizabeth's eyes adjusted to the darkness. The curtains were drawn, but thin moonlight seeped through the edges, casting the room in shades of black and gray. And there, at the foot of her bed, stood a shadow in the shape of a man, perfectly still, perfectly silent, just watching her. Elizabeth's scream caught in her throat, trapped behind terror. Her hand moved slowly toward the bell pull beside her bed, the one that would summon the household, bring men with guns running. Her fingers were inches from the silk cord when the shadow spoke. "No need for that, ma'am." The voice was quiet, respectful, even a man's voice, deep and measured. And somehow that made it worse. The politeness, the lack of threat in the tone, as if standing in a white woman's bedroom in the middle of the night was the most natural thing in the world. But the true horror was that this man had bypassed every lock, every guard, every precaution to deliver a single, devastating message. Who? Elizabeth's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Thomas, ma'am. I work your husband's fields. I've come to deliver something." The shadow moved and Elizabeth flinched, but he was only reaching into his coat, a coat she noticed now, with growing confusion, that looked far too fine for a field hand. He withdrew something small and placed it carefully on her dresser. "Mr. Hartley left this in town," Thomas said. "At the Parker Hotel, in a room he rented under a different name. Thought you might want to see it before he returns from Savannah." Elizabeth stared at the dark shape on her dresser. A book of some kind, or a journal? "How did you—" she started, but Thomas was already moving toward the door. "Wait. How did you get in here?" "The doors are locked. The windows are latched." "Yes, ma'am. I know." "Then how?" "Sometimes doors open for people who know where the keys are kept." His hand was on the doorknob now. "And sometimes people who should keep doors locked forget that their servants know more than they let on." He opened the door. The hinges made no sound. Someone had oiled them recently. Thomas stepped into the hallway, then paused and looked back. "I'd read that journal before Mr. Hartley comes home, ma'am. All of it. Every page. You want to know what kind of man you're married to." Then he was gone. Elizabeth heard his footsteps descending the main staircase, not the servants' stairs in the back, but the grand staircase reserved for family and guests. She heard the front door open with a soft click, heard it close again. She sat frozen in bed for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, moving like a woman in a dream, she rose and walked to the dresser. The journal was leather-bound, expensive. She carried it to the window, pulled back the curtain to let in more moonlight, and opened to the first page. Richard's handwriting. She'd recognize it anywhere, the careful, precise script he used for important business documents. The first entry was dated March 1845, 12 years ago. Met with JH and FB today regarding the Georgia coastal venture. Initial investment required $15,000 per partner. Expected return 400% within 3 years. The risk is considerable, but the alternative is bankruptcy. We agreed to move forward. God forgive us for what we're about to do. She turned the page. More entries, each one more detailed than the last. Descriptions of investments, of partnerships, of ventures Richard had never mentioned to her. Names she recognized: Joshua Harper, Franklin Bradford, William Patterson, Judge Marcus Kent. The most powerful men in the county, all involved in something called the Georgia Coastal Venture. She kept reading. The entries became more explicit. References to cargo and shipments, mentions of a Captain Williams who operated a vessel called the Nightingale, detailed accounts of payments made to customs officials, to harbor masters, to sheriffs in 3 different counties. And then, on a page dated July 1845, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The Nightingale arrived last night at the inlet north of Brunswick. Captain Williams reports 247 souls aboard, 31 lost during the crossing. The survivors are in poor condition, but should recover enough to be presentable within a fortnight. Harper has already arranged buyers in Charleston and New Orleans. We should clear $80,000 after expenses. The venture proceeds as planned. Elizabeth's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the journal. She read the entry again, hoping she'd misunderstood, but there was no misunderstanding possible. Her husband, her respectable, church-going, community pillar husband, had been involved in smuggling slaves directly from Africa, not buying slaves through legal markets, but smuggling them, importing human beings in violation of federal law, in violation of international treaties, in violation of everything their society claimed to stand for, however hypocritically. The act had been illegal since 1808. The punishment was death by hanging. She turned page after page, reading through the night. The operation had continued for 3 years, from 1845 to 1848. Multiple ships, thousands of people smuggled and sold, millions of dollars in profit divided among the conspirators. The journal included everything: names of ship captains, dates of arrivals, numbers of people transported and sold, officials who'd been bribed and how much they'd received, false documentation that had been created, slave markets where the smuggled people had been sold, even the assumed names under which the conspirators had conducted their business. The last entry was dated November 1848. The venture concludes. Today we've agreed to cease operations. The risks have become too great. Federal authorities are investigating smuggling along the Georgia coast. Harper believes we should destroy all records. I disagree. The documentation proves our accounting is correct and protects each partner from false claims by the others. I'll keep this journal secure. No one will find it who shouldn't. Elizabeth closed the journal as dawn began to break. She sat by the window, watching pink lights spread across the fields where slaves, some of whom might have been smuggled here, might have been part of Richard's crime, were already emerging from their quarters to begin another day of forced labor. The question that terrified her most wasn't what Richard had done. It was how Thomas, a slave, had gotten his hands on this journal, and why he'd chosen to give it to her. She was about to learn that the journal in her hands was just the key to a vault containing far darker secrets. Secrets that bound her husband and his friends to the very man they claimed to own. When the household began to stir, Elizabeth rang for her maid and asked that the doors be checked. Every single door in the house was locked from the inside, exactly as they'd been secured the night before. The windows were all latched. The night watchman reported nothing unusual during his rounds. The dogs in their kennel had barked briefly around midnight, but had settled quickly. There was no possible way for anyone to have entered the house. Yet Thomas had been in her bedroom, had stood at the foot of her bed, had spoken to her, placed the journal on her dresser, and walked out the front door. And now Elizabeth knew her husband was a smuggler and a criminal. And she knew that a slave had access to evidence that could hang Richard and a dozen other powerful men. She also knew, with cold certainty, that her life had just become very dangerous. She was now a keeper of a truth that could get her killed, and the only person who seemed to understand its full power was the man who had vanished back into the night. Richard returned from Savannah 3 days later, arriving in the late afternoon with gifts for Elizabeth and their daughter Sarah, silk fabric from a merchant, expensive and lovely. He was in good spirits, talking about successful business dealings, about contracts signed and partnerships solidified. Elizabeth waited until after dinner, until Sarah had gone to bed, until the servants had retired to their quarters. Then she placed the leather journal on Richard's desk in his study. He was pouring brandy when he saw it. The decanter slipped in his hand, splashing amber liquid across the desk. He made no move to clean it up, just stared at the journal as if it were a coiled snake. "Where did you get that?" His voice was barely a whisper. "A man named Thomas brought it to me," Elizabeth said, her own voice steady with suppressed fury. "In our bedroom, in the middle of the night, while I was sleeping." Richard's face went from red to white. "Thomas was in our house? In our bedroom? Standing at the foot of our bed. He placed this on my dresser and walked out through locked doors, past guards and dogs, like he owned the place." Richard collapsed into his chair. "Dear God." "I read it," Elizabeth said. "All of it. Every single page. The ships. The people. The bribes. Everything you did." "Elizabeth, don't." She held up a hand. "Don't insult me with excuses or justifications. I don't want to hear about financial troubles or desperate measures. You smuggled human beings, Richard. You broke federal law. You could hang for this." "I know," he whispered, burying his face in his hands. "Then explain to me how a slave has this journal, how he got into our house, and why you haven't had him killed to protect yourself." Richard looked up at her, and for the first time in their 15-year marriage, Elizabeth saw genuine, unadulterated fear in her husband's eyes. But the explanation he would give was more unbelievable than the crime itself, revealing a terrifying reversal of power that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. "I can't kill him," Richard said, the words flat and defeated. "None of U.S. can. He has copies." He stared at the journal on his desk, the physical proof of his damnation. Multiple copies, hidden God knows where. If anything happens to him, if he disappears, if he dies, even if he's sold away, those copies go to federal authorities, to newspapers in the North, to the British government, which has ships patrolling for smugglers and treaties allowing them to prosecute American citizens. We're not just talking about hanging. We're talking about the complete and utter destruction of every name in that book. Our families would be ruined, our legacies turned to ash. Elizabeth sank into the chair across from him, the magnitude of the trap becoming horrifyingly clear. "How many people know about this?" she whispered. "The conspirators, maybe 15 men total. And Thomas." "Who is Thomas?" she pressed, her mind reeling. "Why was he keeping records for you?" Richard reached for his brandy glass with shaking hands. The operation was complex. Multiple ships, multiple buyers, dozens of transactions. We needed someone to maintain accurate books. Who owed what? Who'd received what? How profits should be divided. We couldn't trust each other to do it honestly. And we couldn't hire a white bookkeeper without risking exposure. "So you used an educated slave." It wasn't a question. Thomas came over on the second voyage in 1845. He could read and write, learned in Africa before his capture. Highly unusual. Harper thought we should keep him, use him. He was intelligent, detail-oriented, perfect for the work. "And it never occurred to any of you," Elizabeth said, her voice icy, "that giving an enslaved man detailed records of your crimes might backfire?" Richard's laugh was a bitter, hollow sound. "Of course it occurred to us. But we needed him, and we thought we could control him. We thought keeping him enslaved, keeping him dependent on us, would be enough." He took a long drink. "But he made copies. We didn't know until 1848, after we'd ended the operation. That's when Thomas sent each of us a message, a single page delivered to our homes. It contained exact details from records, details only he could know, and it made clear that if anything happened to him, everything would become public." The confession hung in the air, but Elizabeth sensed a deeper layer of rot, a truth even more vile than the smuggling. The numbers in that pristine ledger were a sanitized version of a much bloodier reality. "So for 9 years," Elizabeth said, piecing it together, You've been held hostage by your own slave. Yes. And he can come and go as he pleases. Not exactly. He still works the fields, still lives in the quarters. But 3 times a week, he visits each of the conspirators. Walks right up to the main house, comes inside, stays for 10 or 15 minutes, then leaves. What does he do during these visits? Richard's jaw tightened. Nothing. He just exists there. Stands in our homes. Reminds us that he can. That he has power over us. It's psychological, a demonstration of control. And you all just let him. What choice do we have? Richard's voice rose in frustration. If we try to stop him, if we show weakness or fear, he might interpret it as a threat. If we treat him harshly, he might decide revenge is worth his own life. So we maintain this bizarre dance. He walks through our doors, we pretend it's normal, and we all live with this sword hanging over our heads. Yet this silent, staring standoff was a luxury Thomas paid for daily with his blood and sweat in the fields, a duality that was slowly wearing him down even as it terrified his masters. Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened fields. There's something you're not telling me, something worse than what's in the journal. Richard was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. The numbers in that journal aren't complete. What do you mean? The official records show 643 people smuggled over 3 years. But the actual number was higher. Much higher. How much higher? I don't know. Only Thomas knows. He kept 2 sets of books. One for us to divide profits, and one that recorded the truth. The real numbers, including the ones who died during transport, the ones who were sold under false names, the children separated from mothers, the complete accounting of everything we did. Elizabeth felt a fresh wave of nausea. This wasn't just crime. It was a hidden genocide, its true scale known only to the bookkeeper they had created. And those records are what he's holding over you. Yes, because they don't just prove smuggling. They prove murder, fraud, conspiracy. They name every official we bribed, every law we broke, every lie we told. If those records become public, it won't just be hanging. It'll be the destruction of this entire county's leadership. Judges, sheriffs, politicians, plantation owners, everyone who profited or looked the other way. Good, Elizabeth said coldly. You all deserve it. Richard's voice was hollow. Perhaps. But consider what that means for you, Elizabeth. For Sarah. Do you want to be known as the wife of a hanged smuggler? Do you want Sarah to grow up with that shame? Elizabeth closed her eyes. She'd been so focused on the moral horror that she hadn't fully considered the practical consequences for her own life, for her daughter's future. Their fates were now inextricably tied to Thomas's whim, a realization that filled her with a profound and helpless dread. What do we do? She finally asked. We do nothing. We live with it. We wait and hope that Thomas never decides to use what he knows. And we pray that no one else discovers the truth before we're all dead and beyond punishment. That's your plan? Just wait and hope. Do you have a better one? Elizabeth didn't answer. Because she didn't. Outside, in the darkness beyond the window, she thought she saw movement near the tree line. A figure, maybe, or just shadows playing tricks in the moonlight. But she knew, somehow, that Thomas was out there, watching, waiting, always present, even when invisible. And she understood finally why her husband looked so haunted, why all the wealthy men in the county moved through their days with shoulders slightly hunched, as if bearing a weight no one else could see. They were prisoners of their own crimes, and the man who held the key to their cell was someone they tried to treat as property. The irony would have been beautiful if it wasn't so terrifying. Yet, while these powerful men trembled in their studies, the source of their fear was living a life of brutal duality, a performance of power that required constant, exhausting vigilance. While the white families of the county lived in fear of what Thomas might do, Thomas himself lived in a different kind of fear, one that no amount of power over his former masters could eliminate. He worked the Patterson Plantation, owned by William Patterson, a man whose cruelty was legendary. Patterson believed discipline was the foundation of profitable agriculture, and his definition involved regular whippings, reduced rations for minor infractions, and deliberate humiliation designed to break spirits. Thomas worked those fields from dawn until dusk, his hands bleeding at the end of each day, his back aching from bending over cotton plants that seemed to stretch to the horizon. He lived in a cabin that leaked when it rained, ate the same inadequate food as every other slave. In every visible way, he was no different from the hundreds of other enslaved people in the county. But 3 times a week, after the sun set and other slaves were locked in their quarters, Thomas would wash his face, put on the fine coat he kept hidden under his bed, stolen from Patterson's own closet years ago, and walk to the main house. He never hurried, never looked nervous. He walked as if he had every right to be there, as if the path from the quarters to the big house was his to tread. The overseers saw him. Everyone saw him. But no one said a word. The first time it happened, 6 months after Thomas had sent his messages to the conspirators, an overseer named Dutch had tried to stop him. "Where you think you're going, boy?" Dutch had stepped into Thomas's path, rifle raised. Thomas had stopped and looked at him calmly. "Mr. Patterson is expecting me." "Like hell he is. Get back to the quarters before you what?" Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. "Before you shoot me? Go ahead. Pull that trigger. See what happens next." Something in Thomas's eyes had stopped Dutch, not fear, but certainty. The absolute confidence of a man who knew exactly how far his power extended. Dutch had lowered the rifle. "I'll need to check with Mr. Patterson." "Of course. I'll wait." Dutch had run to the house, burst into Patterson's study. "Sir, that slave Thomas is walking up to the house like he owns the place. Should I?" Patterson had gone pale. "Let him through." "But, sir, let him through." Patterson's voice had been sharp with panic. "Don't touch him. Don't threaten him. Don't even look at him wrong. Do you understand me?" That had been 9 years ago. Now, no one even pretended to stop him. But this invisible permission was a threadbare cloak, and Thomas knew that one rash overseer, one moment of drunken bravado, could snap the fragile tension and end everything. Thomas would climb the steps of the Patterson mansion and open the front door without knocking. He walked through the foyer, past the parlor where Patterson's wife sat with her needlework, past the dining room where Patterson's children were finishing their dinner. No one looked at him. No one spoke. It was as if he were invisible, or as if acknowledging his presence would somehow make the situation more real, more dangerous. He found William Patterson in his study, as always, hunched over his desk with a whiskey glass in his hand. Thomas stood in the doorway for exactly 60 seconds, counted them silently in his head. Patterson didn't look up, but his hand shook as he lifted the glass to his lips. When the minute had passed, Thomas turned and walked out the same way he'd come. The entire visit took less than 5 minutes. He spoke no words, made no threats, did nothing except exist in a space where he shouldn't be able to exist. And that was enough, because Patterson knew, they all knew, that Thomas could do so much more. He could deliver those copies to authorities, could stand in a courtroom and testify, could write letters to newspapers, to politicians, to anyone who would listen. The visits were reminders, gentle, silent reminders that the power dynamic had shifted in ways that couldn't be changed. But this ritual, his only taste of autonomy, was also a weekly audition for his own murder, a dare he issued in the hope their fear would always outweigh their hatred. Thomas walked back to the quarters in the darkness. As he approached, he saw Ruth sitting on the steps of her cabin, smoking a pipe she'd made from a corn cob. Ruth was 70 if she was a day brought to America as a child. She'd survived owners, overseers, separations from her children, and every other horror slavery inflicted, and somehow she'd maintained a core of humanity that nothing could break. "Evening, Thomas," she said as he passed. "Evening, Ruth. You have your walk tonight?" "I did." "Patterson still shaking like a leaf when you come in?" Thomas allowed himself a small, grim smile. "He is." Ruth took a long draw on her pipe. "You know they're going to try to kill you eventually. Fear only works so long before it turns to desperation." "I know. And you know that when they do, they'll make it look like an accident. Or like another slave did it. They'll be clever about it." I know that too. Then why you keep walking into their houses? Why not just let them live in fear, without the reminder? Thomas sat down on the steps beside her. This was the only place he felt safe enough to show vulnerability, to let the mask slip slightly. Because, he said quietly, fear fades. Memory softens. People convince themselves that threats aren't real, that consequences won't come. If I stop the visits, within a year they'll have convinced themselves I don't really have the power I claim. They'll start thinking of ways to test me. Better to remind them regularly. That's the practical answer, Ruth said, her eyes knowing in the dim light. What's the real one? Thomas was silent for a moment, the sounds of the night quarters settling around them. The real one, he finally said, is that those walks are the only freedom I have. The only moments where I'm not property, not controlled, not subject to their whims. When I walk through Patterson's front door for those 5 minutes, I'm not a slave. I'm a man with power. And I need those minutes to remember what that feels like. Ruth nodded slowly. Freedom in a cage is still a cage. I know. You could run, she said, not for the first time. Go north. Use those records to buy protection from abolitionists. And abandon everyone else here? Use my knowledge only for myself, while hundreds of other people remain enslaved. You don't owe them anything, Thomas. Survival isn't selfish. Maybe not. But I've spent 9 years keeping those records safe, maintaining that power. If I run, it was all for nothing. If I stay, maybe I can find a way to use what I know to do more than just protect myself. Or maybe, Ruth said, her voice heavy with foresight, you'll just get yourself killed. And then everyone suffers. Thomas stood. Maybe. But at least I'll have died as a man, not property. Ruth shook her head. You're a fool, Thomas. A brave fool, but a fool nonetheless. He went into his cabin, the small, drafty space that was his only private refuge, and pulled up the loose floorboard where he kept his most precious possessions. A pencil nearly worn down to a nub, paper stolen sheet by sheet from Patterson's study over the years, and a small journal where Thomas kept his own records. Not the copies that threatened the conspirators. Those were hidden in locations even he only visited twice a year. This was different. This was personal. In its pages, he wasn't just keeping accounts for white men. He was documenting a quiet war and the birth of a new, terrible hope that was both his strength and his greatest vulnerability. Thomas's carefully balanced world, a tightrope strung between fear and power, was irrevocably tilted by the birth of his daughter, Grace. Her mother, Lily, labored on the Bradford Plantation, 3 miles from Thomas's cabin. The child was a miracle wrapped in terror, a profound new motivation, and a devastating vulnerability. A child of Thomas's would be born into slavery, owned by the cruel Franklin Bradford. But she would also be the daughter of the only slave in Georgia who held power over white men. The target on her tiny back would be enormous from the moment she drew her first breath. We need to get her out, Lily had whispered one night, her hand on her swollen belly. When she's born, we need to get her away from here. Where? How? Thomas asked, the old feeling of powerlessness creeping back at the edges. I can't leave. If I disappear, everything I've built collapses. Then I'll take her. I'll run. They'll hunt you. Bradford will send trackers, dogs. They'll claim you stole valuable property. Then what do we do? Let her grow up enslaved? Let Bradford sell her away when she's old enough to work? Thomas had no answer. He was powerful in specific, narrow ways, but he couldn't protect his own family. The irony was a bitter poison he swallowed every day. The arrival of Grace made the abstract concept of freedom agonizingly concrete and forced Thomas to gamble his most valuable asset, his secrets, for a single piece of paper. When Grace was 6 months old, Thomas made a decision that would test the limits of his strange dominion. He approached Franklin Bradford directly during one of his regular, silent visits. I want to buy my daughter's freedom, Thomas stated, his voice calm in the oppressive quiet of Bradford's study. Bradford, who had been staring fixedly at his desk, looked up in genuine surprise. You want what? I'll pay you for her. For Grace. Name a price. Slaves can't own property. You can't buy anything. Then I'll provide you with information that's worth far more than one infant's market value, Thomas countered, his gaze unwavering. Information about your fellow conspirators. Things they've done that you don't know about. Things that would shift the balance of power among you. It was the most explicit threat he had ever voiced, and it changed the air in the room. Bradford's eyes narrowed. You'd betray the others to save your daughter? Without hesitation, Thomas said. But I prefer a simpler transaction. You set a price. I find a way to pay it through intermediaries. Grace becomes free. He let the offer hang, then leaned forward slightly, the movement calculated. And if I refuse? Bradford asked, though he already knew. Then I'll remember, Thomas said softly, that you had the chance to do one good thing, one small act of decency, and chose cruelty instead. I'll remember that when I decide what to do with the records I hold. It was the closest Thomas had ever come to an explicit threat, and the balance of their strange relationship shifted irrevocably in that moment. Bradford was not just afraid of the records. He was now afraid of being judged morally wanting by the man he owned. Bradford was silent for a long time, the weight of his fear palpable. If I free the child, she has nowhere to go. Lily isn't free. You aren't free. Grace would be free on paper, but functionally still enslaved. She'd have options and I don't, Thomas insisted. She could be sent north, could be placed with free black families who'd raise her. Or she could be kidnapped and re-enslaved. It happens all the time, Thomas. You know that. Thomas did know that. Free papers meant nothing if someone decided to ignore them. I'm offering you the chance, Thomas said finally, to be less of a monster than you already are. Take it or don't. But know that your choice will be remembered. The plea was wrapped in steel, and Bradford, a man hollowed out by years of dread, finally broke. Bradford stood and walked to his safe with a heavy sigh. He pulled out a blank manumission form, the legal document that granted freedom. His hand shook slightly as he filled in Grace's name, her approximate birth date. No payment, Bradford said, not looking at Thomas. I'll free her without cost. Not because I'm merciful, but because I'm tired. I'm so goddamn tired of living like this. Of fearing a man I'm supposed to own. If freeing one child buys me an ounce of peace, so be it. He signed the document and handed it to Thomas. This makes her legally free. It doesn't make her safe. You understand the difference? I do. Then take it and get out of my house. Thomas took the papers carefully, folded them, and placed them inside his coat. He walked to the door, then paused. Thank you, he said quietly. Bradford laughed, a harsh, broken sound. Don't thank me. I did it out of weakness, not virtue. And we both know it. Thomas left the Bradford estate that night carrying the most valuable thing he'd ever possessed. Proof that his daughter was not property. It wasn't safety, but it was a chance. And in a world where enslaved people had no chances, one chance was everything. Yet this hard-won document was a beacon that could also draw danger, making his family a target in a different, more desperate way. While Thomas secured his daughter's future, the conspiracy that bound his masters was beginning to rot from within. The younger generation, raised in the shadow of this unspoken terror, began to question the world they'd inherited. Sarah Hartley, now 17, had grown up seeing Thomas walk silently through her home. She had known about him her entire conscious life, but had never truly paid attention until the night she eavesdropped on a conversation between her father and the mysterious slave. Hearing Thomas speak of justice and his own daughter changed everything. The pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed started to come together, and the picture they formed was deeply disturbing. Driven by a need to understand, Sarah began searching her father's study. She found traces in correspondence, references to the Georgia matter, letters from attorneys discussing statutes of limitations. Then, in a locked trunk in the attic, she found the source, her father's own journal. She read for 3 hours, barely breathing as the full scope of the crimes became clear. The smuggling, the deaths, the profits, and through it all, the repeated mentions of Thomas, the record-keeper. She saw her father and his friends not as pillars of society, but as moral cowards. And she saw Thomas, the man they feared, as the most powerful person in the county. Her entire understanding of hierarchy, of right and wrong, cracked and reformed. She was now a keeper of a secret even more dangerous than the conspiracy itself, the knowledge that the entire social order was a lie. That evening at dinner, Sarah watched her parents with new eyes. "Papa," she said suddenly, "do you ever regret your business decisions? The ventures you invested in years ago?" The silence that fell was absolute. "What brought this on?" Richard finally asked, his fork frozen in midair. "I've been thinking about my future," Sarah said, her voice steady. "About the kind of man I might marry. I'd want someone honorable, someone who made ethical choices even when they were difficult, someone who could sleep peacefully at night." The words landed like stones. "We all make choices," Richard said carefully. "Sometimes circumstances force decisions we'd rather not make." "I know the world isn't simple," Sarah pressed. "But surely there's a difference between difficult choices and wrong choices." "Sarah," her mother interjected, "this is an appropriate dinner conversation." "Isn't it?" Sarah shot back. "We live in a county where people own other people, where we benefit from enslaved labor. Shouldn't we talk about the morality of that?" Her father set down his fork, his face aged. "What exactly are you asking, Sarah?" She met his eyes, the journal's truths burning in her mind. "I'm asking if you sleep peacefully at night, Papa. I'm asking if there are things in your past that haunt you. I'm asking if you believe in accountability for sins." Richard stared at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "No, I don't sleep peacefully. And yes, I believe in accountability. I live with it every single day." Sarah nodded. "Good. You should." She excused herself, leaving her parents in stunned silence. That night, she made a decision. She couldn't undo the crimes, but she could choose not to be complicit in the silence. And if Thomas was the key to the truth, then she needed to speak to him, a decision that would pull her directly into the heart of the storm. Sarah waited for Thomas's next visit, positioning herself in the library. When he entered, he stopped short at seeing her. "Miss Hartley," he said quietly, "you shouldn't be here." "It's my home," she countered. "Why shouldn't I be in the library?" "You know why." Sarah stood. "I read my father's journal, the one from the lockbox in the attic. I know what you're doing, why they're afraid of you." Thomas's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Then you know this conversation is dangerous for both of us." "I know. I don't care." She took a breath. "I want to help." "Help? How?" "I don't know yet. But what my father did was evil. They should be held accountable. If your records can do that, I want to help make sure they're not destroyed." Thomas studied her. "How old are you?" 17. "Young enough to still believe in simple justice," he said. "Old enough to be dangerous if you act without thinking." He moved toward the door. "The best way you can help is to stay silent, stay safe, and wait. When the time comes, and it will come, people with conscience will be needed to rebuild. Be one of those people." "That's not enough. I want to do something now." "Wanting to do something and knowing what to do are very different," Thomas said, his hand on the doorknob. "You can't undo your father's crimes by exposing him. That would destroy your mother, ruin your own future, and accomplish nothing for the people who were smuggled. They're scattered across 5 states now. Justice for them is impossible." "Then what's the point of the records you keep?" Sarah demanded, frustration rising. Thomas paused. "Insurance, protection, and maybe, someday, testimony. But not revenge. Never revenge. Revenge is poison." He looked back at her, his gaze intense. "You want to help? Then when this war comes, and it's coming, anyone can see that, choose the right side. Use whatever privilege you have to help people who have none. That's how you make amends." He left before she could respond. Sarah stood alone, shaking. She had expected to feel heroic. Instead, she felt small and naive. But Thomas was right about one thing. A war was coming, and it would shatter the fragile world of the conspirators, forcing each of them to choose a side in the conflict, and in their own private war with the truth. As the nation hurtled toward disunion, the conspirators' meetings grew more desperate and fractured. William Patterson, his health deteriorating from stress and drink, called an emergency gathering. "The war changes everything," he began, his voice ragged. "If the Union wins, slavery ends. Thomas becomes free. Then we pray for Confederate victory," someone muttered. "And if the Confederacy wins," Patterson shot back, "slavery continues for generations, and we continue living under Thomas's thumb for the rest of our natural lives. Either outcome is untenable." "Then what do you propose?" Richard Hartley asked, though he already suspected the answer. "We eliminate the problem before the war reaches Georgia, while we still have control." "We've been through this," Franklin Bradford protested. Maybe the copies don't matter if everything becomes chaos." Patterson interrupted, slamming a fist on the table. "Think about it. The war provides cover. Thomas dies in the confusion, killed by deserters or Union sympathizers. His instructions become confused. Maybe the records are lost. It's a risk, but it might be our only chance." The room erupted. Some men, paralyzed by years of fear, argued for patience. Others, fueled by a newfound desperation, saw the looming chaos as their only opportunity. "It's murder," Richard said flatly, cutting through the noise. "Say what it is." "It's survival." Patterson roared. "It's cowardice," Richard countered, his voice heavy with resignation. "We committed the crimes. We should bear the consequences." "Easy for you to say," Bradford sneered. "Your fortune was already substantial. Some of us needed." "Don't." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "Don't use necessity as an excuse. We were greedy. Admit it. We saw an opportunity and took it, regardless of the human cost. That's the truth. And Thomas has done nothing but remind us of that truth." The meeting ended with no consensus, but a fatal fracture had formed. Patterson, Bradford, and 3 others were now willing to risk murder. Richard, Dr. Pritchard, and 2 others refused. The rest were paralyzed, waiting to see which side would prevail. Thomas, through his network of informants in the quarters and the big houses, knew about the meeting. He knew Patterson was preparing to act. He knew his time was running out. The standoff was over. The hunt was about to begin. Thomas sat in his cabin, considering his dwindling options. He could run north with Lily and Grace, use the records as leverage with abolitionists. But that meant abandoning everyone else, and his life's work would end with nothing accomplished. He could strike first, deliver the records to authorities now. The conspirators would hang, but his protection would vanish, and their vengeful families might come for him. Or he could choose a third, more audacious path. He could disappear not to flee, but to become a ghost, to weaponize their fear of the unknown. On a moonless night in July 1861, Thomas gathered his few possessions and his daughter's manumission papers. He did not go north. He walked 15 miles to a hidden settlement of free black families, a collection of cabins deep in the woods, known only to those who needed its sanctuary. He arrived exhausted and was taken in by a woman named Naomi. "How long you need to stay hidden?" she asked. "Don't know. Months. Maybe until I see how the war develops." "You in danger?" "Yes. But more importantly, my being visible puts a target on others. If I disappear, it shifts the situation, makes them uncertain instead of desperate." Naomi studied him. "You're the one people whisper about, the slave who walks through white folks' doors." Thomas nodded. "Heard you keep some kind of records." "Protection," Thomas confirmed. "Those records somewhere safe. 3 separate locations with 3 different people. If something happens to me, they have instructions." Naomi smiled slightly. "Smart. You can stay. But you work. No free riders here." Thomas became a ghost in truth, and from the shadows, he began to rewrite the rules of the game, leaving his hunters staring into a darkness of his own making. From his hidden refuge, Thomas executed the final, brilliant move in his long strategy. He mailed letters. Simple, unsigned letters to each conspirator, delivered through normal post. Franklin Bradford received the first. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's. Inside was a single line: "I am neither dead nor gone." The arrangements remain in effect. Any attempts to alter the situation will be interpreted as threats and responded to accordingly. Continue as before. Bradford showed it to Patterson and the others. The effect was immediate and profound. The fragile hope that Thomas's disappearance meant freedom collapsed. The fear returned stronger than ever, because now they didn't even know where he was. They couldn't monitor him, couldn't predict his actions. He had become an invisible, omnipresent threat. Over the following months, other letters arrived. Judge Carter received one. Sheriff Coleman received one. Each was a cold reminder that the sword still hung above them, and the hand holding the thread was now completely unseen. Their desperation curdled into a maddening paranoia. Just as Thomas had calculated, his absence didn't bring relief. It magnified their fear exponentially. And as they jumped at shadows in their own homes, the thunder of real war, Sherman's march, began to rumble toward Georgia, promising a reckoning no letter could prevent. The war reached Georgia in a storm of fire and liberation. General Sherman's march to the sea cut a burning scar through the state, dismantling the world Thomas and his masters had known. Plantations were seized, slaves became contraband, then freedmen. The old social order collapsed into ash and chaos. For the conspirators who remained, Union occupation brought a new, more immediate terror. Military courts, confiscation, and the very federal authority they had spent years fearing. Richard Hartley was sitting in his study, a hollowed-out man awaiting his fate, when the Union soldiers arrived at his plantation in December of 1864. He had been expecting them. The officer in charge, Captain Morrison, was young but carried the weary authority of a man who had seen too much. Richard Hartley? Yes. I'm here to inventory your property and assets. Everything is being recorded for potential confiscation. I understand. Morrison looked around the study, noting the expensive relics of a dying way of life. You owned 43 slaves according to our records. I did. They're free now. Do you have documentation of their origins? Bills of sale? Transfer papers? Richard's heart hammered, the old fear surging back. Some of it. The records are incomplete. Incomplete how? Lost over the years. Fires, misplacement. You know how it is. Morrison's expression remained impassive. Actually, I don't know how it is, Mr. Hartley. I'm from Massachusetts. We freed our slaves nearly a century ago. So explain to me how records of significant, valuable property just disappear. Before Richard could fashion another lie, a new voice spoke from the doorway, calm and clear, delivering a truth that had waited 17 years for this moment. Because some of those slaves were never supposed to exist in the first place. Richard turned. Thomas stood there, but he was transformed. He looked older, healthier. He wore clothes that marked him as a free man, a good coat, boots without holes. He carried himself not with the silent intensity of a specter, but with the quiet authority of an official. Who are you? Morrison asked, his hand moving subtly toward his sidearm. Thomas Freeman. I'm working with the Freedmen's Bureau now, helping newly freed people navigate their rights. I used to be enslaved here, so I know the area. Freeman. He had taken a surname. Richard felt something profound twist in his chest. This man who had been his property now bore a name that signified independence, a fact more shocking than his sudden appearance. Morrison looked between them, sensing the deep, dark current beneath the surface. You know something about missing records, Mr. Freeman? I know that Mr. Hartley and several other men in this county were involved in illegal activities long before the war. Activities that might interest your superiors. Richard closed his eyes. This was it. The moment he had dreaded for nearly 2 decades. The gallows he had imagined in his nightmares. But Thomas continued, his voice measured. However, I'm not sure Union military courts are the appropriate venue for addressing those crimes. They were committed against people who aren't here to testify. The perpetrators are old, broken men who've already paid a high price in psychological suffering. Morrison frowned, confused by this unexpected advocacy. Are you saying you have evidence of crimes, but don't want them prosecuted? Thomas's gaze was steady, encompassing both the captain and the broken planter. I'm saying justice is complicated, Captain. And sometimes mercy serves the future better than vengeance serves the past. Thomas looked directly at Richard, and in that look was the weight of all their shared, terrible history. "I'm saying I've seen enough death. Haven't you?" Richard could not speak. He could only nod, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. Morrison was frustrated but uncertain, his military mandate clashing with this moral calculus from a freed slave. "If you have evidence of crimes, you're obligated to report them." "I'll think about it," Thomas said, a masterful non-answer. "But for now, I'm more interested in helping the people who've just been freed figure out how to survive. That seems more urgent than punishing men who are already destroyed." Morrison, out of his depth and facing a more pressing mission, left shortly after, his suspicions unresolved but his attention redirected. The law had arrived at the door, and Thomas had chosen, calmly and deliberately, not to let it in. When the soldiers were gone, the study was silent save for the crackling fire. Richard finally found his voice, hoarse with emotion. "Why?" he whispered. "What? Why didn't you tell him everything? You had the perfect opportunity. You could have destroyed all of us." Thomas was silent for a long moment, as if weighing the answer he had carried for years. "Because I realized something during my time away," he said finally. "Revenge doesn't free anyone. It just creates new chains." He walked further into the room, no longer a ghost, but a man. "I could have spent the rest of my life watching you hang, testifying at trials. Or I could spend it building something new, instead of tearing down something old." "But we deserve punishment," Richard insisted, the guilt he'd lived with now demanding its due. "Yes, you do," Thomas acknowledged, without malice. "And you'll live with what you did every day for the rest of your life. That's a harsher sentence than hanging, Mr. Hartley. Death is easy. Living with guilt is hard." Richard broke then, sobbing into his hands, the dam of pretense finally shattered. He was not facing a judge, but he was receiving a judgment far more profound. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "For all of it. I know that's not enough, but I'm sorry." Thomas watched him. "I know you are. I'm not sure it matters, but I know." He moved toward the door, the conversation clearly at its end. He had business elsewhere, a future to attend to. "I won't be visiting your house anymore," Thomas said, his hand on the frame. "I'm done with those performances. I'm done living in relation to you and the others. I'm starting a new life on my own terms." "What happens to the records?" Richard asked, the old fear flaring one last time. "They stay hidden," Thomas said, without looking back. "As long as none of you try to restore the old system. As long as you don't interfere with freed people trying to build new lives. But if I hear about any of you attempting to re-enslave people through debt peonage or false charges, if I hear about any backsliding, then everything becomes public. Clear?" "Clear." Thomas left. Richard sat alone in the ruin of his study, feeling not relief, but a hollow emptiness. The terror that had defined him for 17 years was gone, replaced by the crushing, permanent weight of his own conscience. Thomas had been right. The punishment was living, and it had only just begun. For Thomas, however, walking out of that house was the true declaration of independence, a choice to define his future by creation, not destruction. Thomas walked away from Hartley's plantation, and from the entire theater of fear he had meticulously directed. He walked toward Lillian Grace, who had survived the war's chaos, and toward a purpose he had only dreamed of. He worked with the Freedmen's Bureau for 3 years, traveling through Georgia. He used his hard-won literacy and his understanding of both white bureaucracy and black suffering to help former slaves file claims, register marriages, and establish the first shaky foundations of freedom. He saw the hunger for land, the hope for education, the constant threat of violence from resentful former masters. The records remained his secret, a dormant weapon, but his daily work was now his weapon, a pen, a ledger of a different kind, helping to build rather than document ruin. In 1868, Thomas moved his family north to Philadelphia, following a path of quiet exodus. The North was no paradise of equality, but it offered a chance at a normal life, unhaunted by specific ghosts. He opened a small bookshop, a modest business that traded in ideas and stories. Lily took in sewing. Grace, now a bright-eyed girl of 9, attended one of the new schools for black children. For the first time in his life, Thomas experienced something resembling peace. No fear of the whip, no nightly performances of power, no constant vigilance. Just work, family, and the modest, tangible hope of tomorrow. He was Thomas Freeman, businessman, not a specter in a planter's study. The man who could enter any house now owned his own door and kept it open to whoever wished to enter. Years passed. The conspirators died off, one by one, their names fading into obscurity. William Patterson died in 1870, bitter and half-mad. Franklin Bradford drank himself to death by 1872. Richard Hartley succumbed to heart failure in 1868. A letter from his daughter Sarah, who had moved to Philadelphia and become involved in charitable work, found its way to Thomas. "My father died carrying the weight of what he did," she wrote. "I suppose that's a form of justice. You showed me that power doesn't have to mean cruelty." Thomas kept the letter, but never replied. There was nothing to say that wouldn't drag the past into his carefully built present. He was focused on the future, which was taking shape in the form of his daughter, Grace. Grace grew into an intelligent, determined young woman. She became a teacher, dedicating her life to educating black children, ensuring the next generation would have the tool her father had wielded so powerfully: literacy. Thomas never spoke publicly of his past. When asked about his life before Philadelphia, he'd say simply, "I survived slavery." That was enough to know. But in private, he wrote, not for publication, but for Grace, for her children, for the future. He filled pages with his precise script, detailing the smuggling operation, the men involved, the system of complicity. And he wrote about what he had learned. "I could have destroyed them," he wrote in one entry. "I had the evidence, the opportunity, the justification. But I realized that destroying them wouldn't heal anyone, wouldn't free the people who'd already been smuggled and sold. What freed me wasn't exposing them. It was choosing not to." His private journal explored the philosophy forged in his extraordinary crucible. "They lived in prison because of what they'd done. I chose not to live in prison because of what they'd done to me. That choice, that conscious decision to refuse the role of eternal victim or eternal avenger, that was my real freedom." He wrote of power and mercy, of the long game that stretched beyond a single lifetime. The hidden ledgers were a promise of consequences, but his life was a lesson in consequences of a different kind, the positive, generative consequences of choosing to build. Thomas Freeman died in Philadelphia in 1891 at the age of 67. His obituary in a black newspaper described him as a respected businessman and community pillar. There was no mention of smuggling conspiracies, of midnight visits, or of the fear he once inspired in the powerful. He was, on paper, an ordinary man who had lived an ordinary good life. And perhaps, after all he had endured, that was the most extraordinary achievement of all. The official records of the Georgia coastal venture were discovered by accident in 1923 during the demolition of an old church. They were donated to a historical society, where they gathered dust in an archive, a curious but largely ignored artifact of a bygone crime. By then, the men they could have hanged were long dead, their grandchildren unaware of the shadows that had haunted their families. The evidence that had once been powerful enough to hold the social order hostage had become a historical footnote. But Thomas's personal writings, his reflections on power, fear, and the choice for mercy, remained with his family. They were passed down quietly, a sacred inheritance more valuable than any treasure. In those pages, his descendants found not just a story of survival, but a manual for integrity. One of Grace's sons, a teacher like his mother, would read passages to his own children. "Your great-grandfather understood," he would say, "that power is only meaningful if you know when not to use it. That survival isn't the same as victory. That freedom is something you build every day, not something you're given once." The legacy was not in the fear Thomas had wielded, but in the freedom he had modeled, a freedom from hatred, from the endless cycle of retribution. In Philadelphia, A small historical marker was placed near where Thomas's bookshop once stood. It mentions him briefly as a freedman who became a successful businessman and community leader. Nothing about smuggling or midnight power plays. That might seem like erasure, history forgetting the most dramatic parts of his story. But perhaps it is fitting. Thomas spent his enslaved years being defined by his relationship to white power. In death, he is remembered simply for what he built: a life, a family, a lineage of free people. The real memorial is not in bronze or in archived journals. It lives in the fact that Thomas's descendants, teachers, doctors, artists, engineers, walk through a world he helped make possible. They carry his legacy not as a burden of trauma, but as a foundation of strength and choice. The slave who could enter any house at night ultimately didn't need to enter those houses at all. He built his own house instead. And in the quiet choices of his ordinary, extraordinary free life, he won a victory that no court could ever grant. A triumph that echoes in the unshackled potential of every generation that followed him. Thomas knew the truth existed, and he made sure it was preserved. But he also knew that truth without wisdom is just another weapon. And he chose wisdom. That choice, more than any ledger, is what truly set him free. Thomas Freeman died in Philadelphia in the autumn of 1891. He was 67 years old. His death was quiet, in his bed at home, surrounded by his daughter Grace and her young children. The obituary published in the Philadelphia Tribune was brief and respectful. It noted his ownership of a successful bookshop, his long marriage to Lily, and his standing in the community. There was no mention of Georgia, of smuggling, or of plantation owners who trembled at his shadow. To the city's record, he was simply a man who had lived a good life after surviving a bad one. This ordinary ending was, in itself, his most extraordinary achievement. The legend had been laid to rest, but the man had finally lived. His personal effects were unremarkable: clothing, a few books, some modest savings. But for his daughter, he left a sealed oak box. Inside were not the explosive ledgers of the Georgia coastal venture. Those were still hidden elsewhere, but something more precious: his private journals. In these pages, written in his careful, steady hand over decades, was the truth of his heart and mind. He had never written for publication, only for understanding. On the first page of the earliest journal was a sentence that set the tone for all that followed. "This book is not about them. It is about how I ceased to be about them." Grace read the journals by lamplight after her father's funeral. She read of the stifling fear in the Patterson plantation quarters, the surreal power of his silent visits to the great houses, the gut-wrenching love he felt when she was born. She read his intellectual wrestling with the nature of justice. In one pivotal entry, dated just after the war, he had written, "I could have destroyed them. I had the evidence, the opportunity, the bitter desire. But I realized that destroying them wouldn't heal anyone, wouldn't bring back the lost, wouldn't restore the years. It would only make me the final instrument of a system that traded in destruction. What freed me wasn't exposing them. It was choosing not to. In that choice, I took back my soul." These were not the words of a victim or an avenger, but of a philosopher who had walked through the fire and emerged with a hard-won clarity. His power had never been in the ledgers. It had been in the choice to let them molder in silence. The official, physical ledgers of the smuggling conspiracy surfaced, by chance, more than 30 years later. In 1923, workers demolishing a dilapidated church outside Savannah found a rusted strongbox buried beneath the foundation. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 leather-bound journals. They were delivered to the Georgia Historical Society, where a young archivist cataloged them with dry detachment. Entry 847, 1 box assorted papers, shipping manifests and accounts, circa 1840s. Condition poor. The archivist skimmed the pages, seeing lists of numbers, shipments of cargo, payments to officials. To a historian in the Jazz Age, it was a curious but minor artifact of a dead and disgraced economic system, a footnote to the footnote of slavery. The names within, Hartley, Patterson, Bradford, meant little to them. They were just more dead Southern gentlemen, their crimes rendered quaint by time and distance. But on the final page of the third ledger, in a different, more disciplined hand than the others, the archivist found a line that gave him pause. It read, "Let this stand as testimony that the truth exists, whether or not justice is ever served." There was no signature. The archivist shrugged, made a note, and filed the box away in the climate-controlled bowels of the archive. The truth existed, yes, but it was now inert, a specimen under glass. The fiery power it once held to hang men and destroy families had dissipated into the academic air. The weapon had become an artifact. Yet that single unsigned sentence was a message cast into the future, a deliberate signal that the numbers told only half a story, and that a conscience had been here. For the descendants of the conspirators, the 20th century brought a comfortable amnesia. The Hartley fortune, much diminished, was rebuilt in railroads and banking. The Patterson name lived on in law firms. Any whispered family legends of a troublesome slave or a business misunderstanding were polished into vague anecdotes or forgotten entirely. The past was a country they had no wish to revisit. Their power had transformed, sublimated into boardrooms and political connections, utterly divorced from the terror their grandfathers had known in their own studies. The silence Thomas had enforced became, for them, simply the past being past. Meanwhile, Thomas's legacy grew quietly, but vibrantly in a different soil. His daughter Grace became a revered school principal. Her son, named Thomas for his grandfather, earned a medical degree against formidable odds and opened a practice serving Philadelphia's black community. His granddaughter, Eleanor, became one of the first black women to earn a Ph.D. in literature. The family produced teachers, engineers, artists, and activists. They were not defined by trauma, but they were fortified by the story they carried, a story not of vengeance, but of profound, strategic mercy. The tale was shared at kitchen tables, not in public forums. It was a moral compass, not a weapon. The freedom Thomas had secured was not just legal, it was psychological, a freedom from the cycle of hatred. In the 1970s, a graduate student named Marcus Jones, researching economic resistance among the enslaved, stumbled upon the archived ledgers in Savannah. The dry numbers sparked his interest, but it was that final, enigmatic line that haunted him. "Let this stand as testimony." Who wrote it? His research led him down a rabbit hole of property records, Freedmen's Bureau documents, and migration patterns. Slowly, he pieced together a shadowy outline. A literate enslaved bookkeeper, a conspiracy among planters, a standoff that lasted years. He published a dense academic article titled Informational Asymmetry as Power, a case study in antebellum Georgia. It was read by a few dozen specialists. The human heart of the story, the man, his choice, his daughter, remained buried, unseen. The history had been found, but the story was still missing its soul. That soul resided in Philadelphia, in the person of Dr. James Freeman, Thomas's great-grandson and a professor of history. When Marcus Jones's article crossed his desk, James felt a jolt of recognition. The details echoed the family story he'd heard since childhood. He contacted Jones, and the two men met. James brought his heirloom, the private journals of Thomas Freeman. As Marcus read the personal reflections alongside the cold ledger entries, the full, breathtaking narrative came into focus for the first time. Here was not just a slave who held power, but a man who had performed a miracle of moral alchemy, turning the base metal of hatred and fear into a golden rule for living. The academic and the descendants sat in silence, understanding that they held two halves of a single, profound truth. James Freeman chose, after much deliberation, not to publish the journals or seek public vindication. He respected his great-grandfather's choice. Instead, he and Marcus collaborated on a different project. They used the combined documents to create a university course called The Afterlives of Power, Silence, Evidence, and Legacy. Students grappled with Thomas's decision. Was it justice denied or wisdom achieved? Was he right to spare them? The debates were fierce. The course became less about the past and more about the choices every person faces when wronged. Thomas Freeman, who had never spoken publicly in life, became a silent interlocutor in classrooms, challenging young minds a century later. His victory was no longer private. It was pedagogical, shaping future thinkers. The physical sites of the story faded. The Patterson Plantation became a strip mall. The Hartley House burned down in the 1950s. The hidden settlement where Thomas took refuge was swallowed by a pine forest. The landscape held no plaques for him. But in a Philadelphia cemetery, his gravestone still stands. It reads simply, Thomas Freeman, 1824 to 1891. Beloved Father. Visitors, who know no history, see only a name and dates. Those who know the story see a monument to a specific, potent kind of triumph. He is not buried in Georgia soil, which he owned in no way. He is buried in free soil, which he owned in spirit through sheer force of will and character. The man who walked into houses uninvited had earned a plot of earth that was incontestably his own. The family story, honed over generations, crystallized into a central lesson. At a family reunion in 1995, the eldest member, Grace's granddaughter, addressed the children. Your great-great-grandfather, she said, taught us that the most powerful person in the room isn't the one who can destroy others. It's the one who can walk away and build something beautiful. He held the keys to their destruction in his hands, and he chose to let them rust. He chose to build us instead. The lesson was not passive forgiveness, but active creation, the ultimate repudiation of a system designed to make him destroy or be destroyed. His legacy was not a lawsuit or a sensational headline, but a lineage of creators. Today, the two sets of documents exist in separate worlds. The ledgers rest in a climate-controlled archive in Savannah, accessible to any researcher with a card. Thomas's private journals remain in a fireproof safe in a Philadelphia home, brought out only for the coming of age of each new generation. The official record screams with the dry facts of crime. The private record whispers with a hard-won wisdom of survival. One is a corpse on a slab. The other is a living, breathing conscience. Together, they form a complete history, but it is the private half that carries the heartbeat, the half that chose a future over the ruin of the past. History, in its grand narratives, celebrates the loud victories, the battles won, the tyrants overthrown, the laws passed. Thomas Freeman's victory was of a different order. It was silent, psychological, and generational. He won by refusing to let his enemies become the purpose of his life. He won by transforming the energy of resistance into the energy of creation. The plantation owners never stopped him because they couldn't. But his ultimate, sublime triumph was that he eventually stopped letting them matter. He built his own house, filled it with love and learning, and closed the door on the ghosts of Georgia. In doing so, he answered the most profound question his life posed. True power, his story whispers across the years, is not the fearful ability to enter any room. True power is the strength to build a room of your own, to fill it with your own chosen future, and to know that the keys to the old prisons can be left unused to gather dust. It is the power to define your own legacy not by what you defeated, but by what you created. The echo of that choice is found in every free breath taken by his descendants, in every lesson taught, every patient healed, every story written. It is an echo that never fades, a quiet victory that resonates louder than any thunder of revenge. The final ledger is closed, but the story it tells is forever open, a testament to the enduring power of a choice to build, rather than burn.